Read my lips, or you lose your company by tomorrow morning.
Read my lips, or you will lose your entire company by tomorrow morning. Sophia Reed whispered, her voice a chilling blade of absolute calm as she reached out and deliberately killed the teleprompter screen, just 5 seconds before they went live on national television. The sudden blank blackness of the monitor reflected the sheer, unadulterated panic that instantly flooded Alexander Vance's face, a stark contrast to his perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit and his notorious Playboy swagger. Around them, the frantic energy of the New York broadcasting studio was a deafening roar of countdowns, scrambling producers, and adjusting camera lenses. But within their isolated bubble of tension, the air had turned to ice. "What the hell are you doing?" Alexander hissed through clenched teeth, his jade eyes flashing with a violent mixture of fury and disbelief as the floor director raised 3 fingers in the air. "Saving your life, mister." "Vance," Sophia replied, her posture rigidly perfect, her gaze locked onto his with the unyielding intensity of a predator who had just trapped her prey. "The script your legal team prepared was a meticulously crafted suicide note, designed to make you look like an incompetent fraud. So when the red light turns on, you will mirror exactly what I mouthed to you. Or I will walk out that door and let the wolves tear you apart." The red light flashed on the main camera, signaling the broadcast was live, and Sophia took a calculated step back into the shadows, leaving the billionaire completely exposed to the merciless glare of 1,000,000 viewers. For a fraction of a second, the notorious CEO of Vance Enterprises looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down into the abyss of his own ruined legacy. The silence in the studio stretched thick and suffocating as the veteran anchor introduced the man currently embroiled in the most scandalous corporate embezzlement investigation of the decade. Then Alexander's eyes found Sophia standing just off camera, her face illuminated by the ambient glow of the studio monitors, her lips moving in a slow, deliberate cadence. Swallowing his pride, Alexander straightened his shoulders, summoning the charismatic armor that had adorned 100 magazine covers, and began to speak the words she silently fed him. He didn't stutter, he didn't falter. He delivered her carefully engineered narrative of accountability, internal audits, and unwavering commitment to transparency with a gravity that commanded instant respect. Every syllable he uttered felt like a bitter pill, a submission to the ruthless crisis manager he had been forced to hire just 48 hours ago to salvage his sinking empire. Yet as he watched the anchor's hostile expression slowly soften into a nod of reluctant understanding, Alexander realized with a sickening twist in his gut that Sophia Reed was flawlessly orchestrating the greatest PR miracle of the year, and she was using him as her incredibly expensive, highly customized puppet. The moment the heavy, soundproof door of the VIP dressing room clicked shut behind them, the fragile illusion of control shattered into 1,000,000 jagged pieces. Alexander spun around, his hands balling into fists at his sides, the adrenaline of the high-stakes broadcast morphing instantly into explosive anger. "Don't you ever pull a stunt like that again, Sophia," he roared, closing the distance between them until his towering frame cast a dark shadow over her. "You hijacked a live national interview. You destroyed a statement vetted by my entire board of directors, and you treated me like a lobotomized child in front of the press." Sophia didn't flinch, didn't retreat a single inch. She simply stood her ground, her expression a mask of bored indifference as she picked up a sleek black folder from the vanity table. Your board of directors is actively trying to throw you in federal prison, Alexander, she stated, her voice devoid of any emotional inflection, cutting through his rage like a scalpel through tissue. That statement was drafted by your uncle's lawyers to sound like a subtle admission of guilt, a beautifully worded confession that would have tanked your stock prices by 30% the moment the markets opened. She tossed the thick folder onto the table between them, the loud smack echoing in the tense silence. You hired me to clean up your mess, not to coddle your inflated ego. So until you are cleared of these fraud charges, you do not think, you do not speak, and you do not breathe without my explicit permission. Alexander stared at the folder, his chest heaving, as the harsh, undeniable truth of her words chipped away at his arrogant facade. He was a man who thrived on reckless freedom, a regular fixture in the city's elite nightlife. But the sudden, catastrophic allegations of embezzling corporate funds had cornered him into a nightmare he couldn't charm his way out of. He looked at Sophia, truly taking in the rigid perfection of her austere gray suit, the tight bun that allowed no stray hairs, and the cold, calculating intelligence in her dark eyes. "What is that?" he asked, his voice dropping to a cautious, gravelly murmur as he nodded toward the black folder. "That, Mr. Vance, is your salvation," Sophia replied, stepping forward and flipping the folder open to reveal a dense, 50-page legal document filled with aggressive clauses and uncompromising stipulations. The public doesn't trust a bachelor who spends his weekends spraying champagne on yachts in Monaco, especially not when billions of investor dollars are missing from his company's accounts. She tapped a manicured fingernail against the top of the contract. To survive the emergency board meeting this Friday, you need a radical image overhaul. You need to transition overnight from a reckless liability into a grounded, responsible family man who is firmly anchored to reality. Alexander let out a harsh, humorless laugh, shaking his head as he backed away from the table. "You want me to fake a relationship? With who? One of those socialite airheads my uncle keeps trying to force down my throat?" "No, Alexander, because none of them have the credibility or the sheer willpower to handle the absolute circus your life has become," Sophia countered, her gaze locking onto his with a terrifying, unwavering certainty. "You are going to be publicly, passionately, and unshakably engaged to me." The silence that followed her declaration was so profound that Alexander could hear the faint hum of the city traffic 14 stories below. He stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but her face remained as expressive as carved marble. "You're out of your mind," he finally whispered, genuine shock rippling through his system. "You despise me, Sophia. You've made it abundantly clear that you consider me a spoiled, arrogant parasite who inherited an empire he doesn't deserve to rule." She didn't deny it, simply crossing her arms and holding her chin high. "My personal feelings regarding your character are entirely irrelevant to the success of this campaign," she stated coldly. "The narrative is bulletproof. The brilliant, no-nonsense crisis manager steps in to save the wayward CEO, only to discover a deeply misunderstood man beneath the tabloid scandals, leading to a profound, unexpected romance." She stepped closer, invading his personal space, her scent of sharp citrus and cold espresso filling his senses. "It gives you immediate credibility. It humanizes you to the shareholders, and most importantly, it places me in a position to monitor your every single move." Alexander felt a suffocating sensation tighten in his throat, realizing the steel trap she had meticulously designed for him. He leaned down, bringing his face inches from hers, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate a woman who seemed entirely immune to intimidation. "And what exactly does this little performance entail?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Total surrender," Sophia replied, without missing a beat, her eyes holding his with unflinching dominance. "You will grant me full power of attorney over your public assets. You will surrender your passport, your social media accounts, and your private phone." She rattled off the demands like a general outlining the terms of a brutal surrender. "You will attend every gala, every charity dinner, and every press conference with me on your arm, looking at me as if I am the absolute center of your universe. There will be no late nights, no unexplained absences, and absolutely no other women." Alexander's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached, his pride violently rebelling against the absolute submission she was demanding. "You want to put me on a leash," he sneered, his hands gripping the edge of the vanity table until his knuckles turned white. "I am placing you in a quarantine, Alexander," she corrected smoothly. "Because if left to your own devices, your reckless incompetence will hand your father's legacy directly to the men trying to destroy you." The mention of his father's legacy hit Alexander like a physical blow, piercing through the layers of defensive apathy he had worn for years. He knew deep down in the dark, isolated corners of his mind that she was right. His uncle had orchestrated a brilliant, deadly trap, and Alexander had played right into it by acting the part of the careless heir. He looked at the contract, the dense legal jargon, a stark representation of the prison he was about to willingly enter. "If I do this, Sophia, if I sign my life over to you," he said, his voice dropping the sarcasm, revealing a fleeting glimpse of the exhausted, cornered man beneath. "You better be damn sure this works, because if I go down, I am dragging your immaculate reputation into the flames with me." Sophia picked up a silver fountain pen and held it out to him, her expression devoid of fear or hesitation. "I do not fail, Mr. Vance." She stated the absolute certainty in her voice, a cold comfort in the chaotic storm of his life. Alexander took the pen, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second, a brief, startling spark of static electricity that neither of them acknowledged. He bent over the table, pressing the nib to the paper, and with a swift, angry motion, signed away his freedom, binding himself to the most ruthless, controlling woman he had ever met. As the ink dried on the paper, securing the darkest, most deceptive contract of his life, Alexander straightened up, tossing the pen aside. The power dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted. He was the billionaire CEO, but Sophia Reed was now the undisputed master of his fate. She carefully picked up the folder, snapping it shut with a satisfying final click that echoed through the dressing room like the locking of a cell door. "Our first public appearance as an engaged couple will be at the Plaza Gala tomorrow evening," she instructed, immediately shifting into her professional gear, her eyes already scanning her phone for emails. "A car will pick you up at 7 sharp. Wear the navy Brioni suit and try to practice looking hopelessly devoted in the mirror." Alexander watched her turn toward the door, a sudden, fierce determination igniting in his chest. "You might have absolute control over my schedule." "Sophia," he called out, stopping her with his hand on the doorknob. He stepped closer, his green eyes burning with a challenging, dangerous fire. But don't forget that this is a game of pretend, and when you force a man to act like he's obsessed with you, you might just get burned by the performance. Sophia glanced over her shoulder, her perfectly sculpted face offering a chilling, beautiful smirk. I don't play with fire, Alexander. I extinguish it, she whispered, and walked out the door, leaving him alone in the suffocating reality of their new explosive arrangement. The next 24 hours were a meticulously orchestrated symphony of deception, with Sophia as the conductor and Alexander as the reluctant lead performer. By midday, the news of their sudden engagement had already incinerated the tabloid circuit, the photos taken from the studio shoot circulating on every major media outlet, with headlines screaming about the unexpected romance that had tamed the city's most notorious bachelor. Inside the gilded, high-security walls of the Vance Enterprises headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating tension of corporate warfare. Alexander sat at the head of the mahogany conference table. His phone confiscated his social media accounts, locked, and his every public word filtered through Sophia's ironclad PR team. She sat at his right hand, a constant, sharp-eyed sentry, her laptop open as she monitored the stock fluctuations and the public sentiment shift in real time. Every time a board member dared to challenge his decision, Sophia interjected with a polished, devastating counterpoint that left them scrambling for words, leaving Alexander to watch in both awe and irritation as his own authority was systematically usurped by the woman who was supposed to be his submissive partner. The dinner with the board of directors that evening was the first real test of their performance. A high-stakes arena where the sharks were waiting for even a single hint of vulnerability. As they entered the private dining room, Sophia immediately shifted her entire demeanor. The sharp, commanding crisis manager vanished, replaced by the perfect, elegant, and doting fiancé. She took Alexander's arm, her touch light yet possessive, and leaned in to whisper something in his ear. A gesture that looked to the gathered vultures like a moment of intimate affection. When he turned his head to look at her, she offered him a smile that looked so genuine, so filled with soft, private adoration, that he momentarily forgot he was acting. "They are watching us like hawks," she whispered, her voice a low, honeyed cadence meant to be overheard, as she reached up to adjust his tie with a tender, lingering touch. "Just play your part, darling," she murmured, her dark eyes shimmering with a light that felt far too real for a business arrangement. He played along, resting his hand on the small of her back, a gesture he initially intended to be possessive, yet the way her body moved against his, the subtle heat that radiated through her silk dress, made his heart skip a rhythm that had nothing to do with the script. Throughout the meal, the board members launched a barrage of thinly veiled interrogations, questioning Alexander's judgment, his recent lifestyle choices, and the sudden, suspicious nature of this engagement. It was a calculated attempt to break his composure, to force him into a defensive outburst that would validate their claims of him being a liability. Sophia, however, didn't give them an inch. She navigated their condescending remarks with a grace that was as elegant as it was lethal. Alexander's focus has been shifted toward the long-term sustainability of the Vance legacy, she stated, her voice projecting a confidence that seemed to anchor the entire room. She placed her hand over his on the table, her skin warm and soft against the cold hardness of his ring. "And I am here to ensure that his vision is supported by the stability he requires." Alexander watched her, a strange, uncomfortable fascination blooming in his chest as he realized she wasn't just defending him. She was actively crafting a narrative that he was actually starting to believe himself. For a fleeting moment, he caught his uncle Marcus Vance, watching them from across the table, his eyes narrow, his expression a mask of venomous calculation. Alexander realized with a cold shudder that the more believable their performance became, the more dangerous it was for his uncle's plans to seize control of the board. The ride back to the penthouse was a suffocating descent into a silence that felt heavy with the weight of the night's events. The city lights streaked past the tinted windows, painting long, abstract ribbons of neon across the interior of the sleek black SUV. Sophia hadn't let go of his hand since they left the restaurant, her grip firm and constant, a tactile reminder of the prison he had signed himself into. Alexander looked down at their joined hands, the stark contrast of her slender, pale fingers against his larger, scarred hand, triggering a jolt of raw, unwelcome electricity that rippled through his veins. "You were brilliant tonight," he murmured, his voice sounding raspy and strange in the confined space. "The board members were practically eating out of your hand." Sophia didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the flashing city lights outside. "The board members were looking for blood, and I merely gave them a story they couldn't afford to attack," she replied, her voice cooling instantly as the protective, devoted fiancé persona dissolved. She finally looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face with an intensity that felt like she was dissecting his very soul. "But you, Alexander, you surprised me. You actually listened to my cues. I expected you to go rogue and humiliate us both before the main course was served." Alexander let out a low, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I have too much at stake to play the fool, even if I despise the leash you've put me on." He leaned back against the plush leather seat, his eyes darkening as he studied her. "But tell me something, Sophia. How much of that performance back there was for the board, and how much of it was just you enjoying the power of owning me?" Sophia's expression remained as unreadable as ever, though a subtle tightness appeared at the corners of her mouth. "I do not need to enjoy the power to know how to wield it," she said calmly, turning her attention back to her phone. "And I suggest you focus your energy on tomorrow's schedule, because we have a 3-hour interview with the Wall Street Journal, and I expect you to have those talking points memorized by 6 a.m. She was already retreating into the safety of her professional coldness, the brief spark of their intimacy extinguished as efficiently as she had killed the teleprompter. Alexander watched her, a surge of inexplicable frustration and raw, jagged longing tearing through his composure. He was realizing with a terrifying clarity that the more he acted the part of her devoted partner, the more he found himself wanting the performance to be something permanent, something real. By the time they reached the penthouse, the silence had become a physical presence, a tangible force that made the expansive, minimalist living room feel like a cold, empty tomb. Sophia went straight to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of chilled water, her posture as rigid and composed as if she were still in front of the board. Alexander followed her, his boots thumping against the polished concrete floor, unable to bear the weight of his own restless thoughts. He watched her for a moment, the fluid, graceful way she moved, the way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the precise, clinical way she held the glass. He felt like a man observing a masterpiece he was forbidden to touch. "You really have no other life, do you?" he asked, his voice low, a mix of curiosity and genuine concern that he immediately regretted. Sophia set the glass down with a soft click, her back still to him. My life is focused on the objectives at hand, Alexander. That is why I am the best at what I do. She turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of genuine fatigue in her eyes, a shadow of exhaustion that she worked so hard to hide behind her impenetrable mask. You wouldn't understand, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. For some of us, stability is not a given. It is a fortress that has to be rebuilt every single day. The words struck him with a surprising force, offering a glimpse into the motivations of the woman who seemed to operate on nothing but iron willpower and cold logic. Before he could respond, before he could bridge the sudden, vulnerable gap between them, the elevator chime echoed through the penthouse, a sharp, unwelcome intrusion. Alexander's stomach dropped. He knew that sound, and the timing was catastrophic. His phone, which had been confiscated, buzzed in Sophia's purse, signaling an emergency bypass. She pulled it out at her face, going instantly pale as she read the notification. "It's your uncle," she said, her voice strained, her eyes locking onto his with an expression of sudden, intense panic. He just released the confidential files regarding the internal audit to the press. They are running the story in 15 minutes. The air in the room grew thin and jagged, the reality of their situation shifting instantly from a strategic game to a desperate survivalist battle. "He's going to use the audit to prove that you were embezzling funds," she said, her voice rising in urgency, her professional mask completely shattering. "Alexander, if this goes live, the board will call an emergency meeting to vote you out, and you will not have a chance to defend yourself." The perfect, calculated engagement they had built was on the verge of being swallowed whole by the very scandal they were trying to navigate. Alexander grabbed his phone from her, his fingers flying across the screen to view the incoming headlines, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The rumors weren't just accusations anymore. They were citing detailed, falsified ledgers that looked devastatingly authentic. "He's been planning this from the start." Alexander growled, his voice a low, primal roar as he paced the living room, his mind racing to find a move that didn't lead to total destruction. He's got the CFO in his pocket. He's got the records forged, and he has the media narrative pre-written. Sophia stood in the center of the room, her eyes narrowed, her mind already calculating the variables of their defeat. She had never been outmaneuvered, never been forced to retreat, and the prospect of losing, of seeing her strategy dismantled by his uncle's blatant corruption, ignited a fierce protective fire in her soul. She looked at Alexander not as her contractual project, not as her arrogant, spoiled client, but as a man who was about to lose everything he had spent his life trying to understand and protect. "We can't stop the press," she said, her voice cold and lethal, a new edge of determination entering her tone. "So we have to change the story entirely." Alexander stopped pacing, looking at her with a mix of shock and intense, budding respect. How he whispered, his voice thick with the desperation of a man on the edge. Sophia walked to the wall-to-wall glass windows, looking out at the city below, her mind a whirling engine of tactical maneuvers. "Your uncle thinks he's playing a game of corporate chess," she said, her eyes glinting with a dangerous, thrilling light. "He's going to release those files to bury you, to frame you as a criminal in the eyes of the public." She turned back to him, her expression hardening into something terrifyingly beautiful. "We don't just refute those documents. We declare them an act of industrial sabotage," she stated, her voice projecting the absolute authority that had built her reputation. "We go to the media. We claim that the ledgers were falsified by your uncle to stage a coup within the board, and we initiate an immediate independent federal investigation before he even has the chance to present his case." Alexander stared at her, the sheer audacity of her plan leaving him momentarily breathless. "And if they ask for proof? If they ask why I didn't see these anomalies earlier? That is where the fiancé comes in," Sophia said, her gaze fixed on his with an intensity that made the air in the room feel heavy and charged. "We use the engagement to spin a narrative of a man who was blinded by his trust in his uncle. A narrative of betrayal that will generate more sympathy and public outrage than any dry corporate scandal ever could." She was using her own plan, her own deception, to fight a war on his behalf. And in that moment, the line between her tactical control and her genuine dedication to his survival became fundamentally blurred. The flashbulbs of 50 synchronized cameras erupted like a localized lightning storm inside the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, blinding the elite guests and illuminating the sheer tension radiating from Alexander Vance. It had been less than 24 hours since his uncle Marcus had leaked the doctored financial ledgers to the press, and the resulting media frenzy had turned this annual charity gala into a spectacular high-stakes battlefield. Sophia Reed stood flawlessly at Alexander's side, her posture an impenetrable fortress of calm, wrapped in an emerald silk gown that commanded the room's attention just as effectively as her reputation. "Keep your jaw relaxed and your eyes strictly on me when they shout their questions," she murmured, her voice a soothing, razor-sharp anchor against the cacophony of the approaching reporters who were hungry for the blood of a fallen billionaire. Alexander tightened his grip on her waist, the physical contact no longer feeling like a contractual obligation, but rather a vital lifeline, keeping him from drowning in the venomous whispers of his peers. He nodded, summoning a practiced smile that masked the furious, chaotic tempest raging in his chest, acutely aware that his entire legacy currently balanced on the edge of Sophia's meticulously crafted narrative of familial betrayal and industrial sabotage. The strategy was brilliant in its audacity, positioning Alexander not as an incompetent playboy who lost billions, but as the tragic victim of a greedy older generation desperate to cling to power. As a ruthless journalist from the Financial Times shoved a microphone forward, demanding a statement on the embezzlement charges, Sophia didn't flinch. She leaned into Alexander, her expression a masterclass in wounded solidarity. "Alexander is currently cooperating fully with federal authorities to uncover the true source of this malicious corporate sabotage," Sophia stated, her voice projecting a chilling, absolute authority that immediately silenced the clamoring reporters. She turned her gaze to the cameras, her eyes burning with a fierce protective conviction that sent a strange, powerful jolt straight into Alexander's heart. "It is a profound tragedy when the very mentors you trust to safeguard a family legacy attempt to destroy it out of sheer, desperate ambition." The subtle, unmistakable accusation hung heavy in the opulent air, a direct, calculated missile aimed straight at his uncle's reputation, and Alexander watched in awe as the media pack immediately swallowed the bait, their narrative shifting in real time from condemnation to intrigued sympathy. The momentary victory, however, was violently interrupted by a slow, mocking applause that cut through the fading chatter of the press, echoing ominously from the grand staircase. Marcus Vance descended the marble steps with the arrogant, sweeping stride of a king surveying his conquered territory, his silver hair catching the chandelier light as his cold, calculating eyes locked onto his nephew. "A magnificent performance, Miss Reed. I always knew my nephew's money could buy the finest fiction in New York." Marcus sneered, his voice carrying the distinct patrician drawl of a man who believed he was utterly untouchable. The surrounding aristocrats and industry titans fell completely silent, parting like the Red Sea to give the warring family members a wide, voyeuristic berth. Alexander felt the familiar, destructive inferno of his temper ignite, his muscles coiling as he took a threatening step forward to silence the man who had spent the last decade secretly dismantling his father's company. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here tonight, Marcus, especially after the trail of forged documents you left bleeding across the financial sector." Alexander growled, his voice a low, lethal rumble that threatened to shatter the poised, victimized image Sophia had just spent hours constructing. Before Alexander could compromise their strategy with a reckless outburst, Sophia stepped fluidly in front of him, physically blocking his path while using her own body to shield his vulnerability from the prying eyes of the elite. "And you have a lot of nerve interrupting my evening with your desperate aging insecurities, Marcus," Sophia countered, her tone dangerously soft, yet carrying a venom that made several nearby executives physically wince. Marcus's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, entirely unused to being addressed with such blatant, unvarnished disrespect by anyone, let alone a hired public relations consultant. "You are treading in waters far too deep for a paid escort, Ms. Reed," Marcus hissed, his face flushing with a sudden, ugly anger as he tried to reassert his dominance over the conversation. "Alexander is a sinking ship, a pathetic, incompetent boy who couldn't even manage his own bank accounts. And when the board convenes on Monday, no amount of your pathetic spin will save him from federal prison." He looked at Alexander with a gaze filled with sheer, unadulterated loathing, a look that tore at the deepest, most insecure wounds Alexander had carried since his father's death, reinforcing his worst fear that he truly was a failure. Sophie didn't retreat. Instead, she closed the distance between herself and the older man, her dark eyes flashing with a terrifying, predatory intelligence that made Alexander's breath catch in his throat. "It's fascinating that you speak of bank accounts, Marcus, considering the rather clumsy offshore transactions funneled through the Cayman shell corporations over the last 3 quarters. Sophia murmured, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for the 3 of them, perfectly executing a calculated psychological strike. Marcus went deathly pale, the arrogant color draining completely from his cheeks as the horrifying realization hit him that Sophia hadn't just been managing the press, she had been actively hunting his financial trail. Alexander stared at her profile, his heart hammering against his ribs in a chaotic rhythm of shock and profound admiration, suddenly realizing that this woman was risking her entire pristine career to genuinely protect his life. "You are bluffing." Marcus choked out a bead of cold sweat forming at his temple as he desperately tried to maintain his composure under her lethal, unwavering scrutiny. "I never bluff, Marcus. I simply wait for the perfect moment to burn my enemies to the ground," Sophia replied, her voice smooth as silk, cementing her absolute dominance over the man who had terrorized Alexander for years. Driven by sheer panic-stricken desperation and a need to reclaim the narrative in front of the watching ballroom, Marcus lashed out with the only weapon he had left: public humiliation. "You think you can save him with a fake engagement and empty threats?" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing loudly across the silent room, ensuring every journalist and shareholder heard his vicious accusation. Look at them. This woman is nothing but a highly paid mercenary, a soulless corporate fixer who wouldn't touch this failure of a man if he wasn't signing her multi-million-dollar checks. The whispers erupted instantly, a tidal wave of scandalous murmurs crashing over the crowd as the camera flashes began to pop again, eager to capture the spectacular collapse of their fabricated romance. Sophia stood frozen, the sudden brutal public attack on her professional integrity and her hidden burgeoning feelings for Alexander hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She had built her entire life on absolute control, on never letting the world see her bleed, but standing under the harsh glare of 100 judgmental eyes, she felt the terrifying, familiar sting of total vulnerability. Alexander saw the microscopic tremor in Sophia's hands, saw the impenetrable fortress of her composure crack under the weight of his uncle's vicious cruelty. And a fierce, overwhelmingly protective instinct shattered the last of his own defensive walls. He didn't care about the cameras, the board of directors, or the carefully scripted PR timeline. He only cared about the magnificent, ruthless woman who had just placed herself in the line of fire for him. "My uncle is right about one thing," Alexander announced, his voice booming across the ballroom with a commanding, resonant power that forced absolute silence to fall over the crowd once more. He reached out, grabbing Sophia by the waist and pulling her flush against his chest, eliminating every millimeter of professional distance between them as he stared defiantly into the sea of shocked faces. "I am a failure of a man because it took me nearly losing my entire company to finally realize that the most incredible, brilliant woman in the world was standing right in front of me." Without giving his uncle or the press another second to react, Alexander lowered his head and crushed his mouth against hers, initiating a kiss that violently, irrevocably destroyed every rule of their contract. The kiss was a cataclysmic collision of fire and ice, starting as a desperate, protective display for the audience, but instantly morphing into a raw, consuming confession of everything they had been fighting to suppress. Sophia gasped against his lips, her hands instinctively flying up to grip the lapels of his suit, her meticulously guarded mind going completely blank as the sheer, intoxicating heat of his mouth overwhelmed her senses. Alexander kissed her with a starving, possessive intensity, his tongue tracing her bottom lip, demanding entrance, pouring all his unspoken fears, his gratitude, and his terrifying new affection into the embrace. For Sophia, the woman who had sworn to never trust love again, the solid, unwavering strength of his body holding her up felt like the safest place on earth, a startling sanctuary amidst the chaos of their lives. She surrendered to the moment, opening her mouth to him, kissing him back with a fierce, answering hunger that sent a shockwave of pure electricity straight down to Alexander's toes. The ballroom around them ceased to exist. There were no cameras, no manipulative uncles, no scandals, just the breathtaking, undeniable truth that they were both drowning in a feeling they could no longer deny. When Alexander finally, reluctantly pulled away, they were both breathless, their chests heaving in unison, the air between them thick with a jagged, undeniable intimacy that left them completely exposed. He rested his forehead against hers, his green eyes dark with a chaotic mixture of terror and wonder as he stared into her equally shocked, dilated pupils. The absolute silence in the ballroom was finally broken by a frenzy of camera shutters, capturing the undeniable, blazing chemistry that no amount of money or PR training could ever fake. Marcus stood a few feet away, his face contorted in defeated rage, realizing that he had just inadvertently solidified their narrative by forcing them to prove their devotion on a spectacular public stage. Alexander didn't spare his uncle a single glance. He simply took Sophia's trembling hand in his, lacing their fingers together tightly, a silent, ironclad promise. "Let's go home," he murmured, his voice husky and rough, meant only for her. And as they walked out of the ballroom together, leaving a stunned high society in their wake, they both knew that the contract was dead, and the real, terrifying game had just begun. The trap snapped shut with the cold, calculated precision that Sophia had spent her entire career perfecting. But as she sat in the dimly lit interrogation room of the SEC building, the air felt thin and toxic. The documents she held were not just evidence of Marcus's financial crimes. They were the final, damning proof that the structural sabotage at the Vance processing plant had been orchestrated by him. Yet standing behind the reinforced glass, Alexander looked not like a man who had been saved, but like someone who had just suffered a terminal betrayal. His eyes, usually vibrant with the fire she had come to crave, were hollow, reflecting a deep, devastating hurt that made her own chest tighten with an unfamiliar, sharp pain. "You played this entire thing from the start, didn't you?" Alexander asked, his voice low, lacking its usual commanding edge, replaced by a weary, hollow resonance. "The interview, the gala kiss, this investigation. You were just building the case to secure your own reputation, while you let me believe we were actually fighting for something real." Sophia stood the heavy silence in the room, pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight. The absolute control she had cultivated over the past weeks slipping through her fingers. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to explain the necessity of the deception, to tell him that every tactical move she had made was specifically designed to ensure his survival. But the words died in her throat. She looked at his face, the man who had laid his heart on the line for her, and she realized the devastating truth. She had been so focused on winning the game that she had treated his trust as a tactical variable rather than a sacred bond. "I did what I had to do to protect you, Alexander," she whispered, her voice cracking the professional, ice-cold armor she had worn for a lifetime, finally disintegrating. "Every move, every lie, every script I forced you to read, it was all to keep you from losing the life you built." Alexander turned away from the glass, his silhouette sharp and isolated against the harsh, unforgiving light of the room, his entire frame radiating a profound, absolute exhaustion. "You protected the billionaire Sophia, but you destroyed the man," he said, and the finality in his tone was more lethal than any of his uncle's schemes. As the authorities moved in to formally arrest Marcus, the atmosphere in the building became a whirlwind of frantic activity, flashing lights, and the muffled shouts of reporters gathered outside the main entrance. Sophia watched from the sidelines as the cuffs clicked onto her former adversary's wrists, the satisfying conclusion of her long, dangerous campaign. Yet she felt no triumph, no surge of professional satisfaction. She only felt the cold, hollow ache of a victory that had cost her the only thing that had ever made her feel genuinely alive. The board of directors, already informed of the federal findings, was scrambling to issue an apology, their faces pale and desperate as they realized the magnitude of the scandal they had almost been a part of. The media circus was now focused entirely on the redemption of Alexander Vance, the tragic victim who had been betrayed by his own family. And as he stood before the swarm of microphones, he looked like a man who had won the war but lost his soul. He didn't look at her. He didn't even acknowledge the woman who had effectively dismantled his enemies and secured his future. The fallout was swift and total, leaving Sophia standing in the center of a victory that felt like a funeral. She returned to her empty, pristine office, the files and reports on her desk, a testament to a career defined by detachment and tactical superiority. She had dismantled the enemy, she had saved the empire, and she had fulfilled her contract to the letter. But as she stared at the screen of her computer, she realized her life was exactly the cold, controlled void she had once believed was a sanctuary. Every headline praising her as the most ruthless crisis manager in the city now felt like an indictment, a reminder that she had won by sacrificing the only person who had ever truly seen her beneath the masks she wore. The phone on her desk buzzed a notification from the PR team about the next press cycle, but she didn't pick it up. For the first time in her life, she let the silence rule. She sat in the darkness, the weight of her own choices crushing her, realizing that she had mastered the art of managing crises, but she had failed the only test that mattered. She had been too afraid to be real. The final, decisive blow came when she reached for her bag, only to find the engagement ring, the one they had chosen for the performance, resting quietly at the bottom of her purse, a small, glittering remnant of a life they had played at. She pulled it out, the cold metal biting into her skin, and felt a rush of raw, unadulterated regret that she had been so expertly suppressing behind her layers of tactical strategy. She had pushed him away to win the game, and she had succeeded perfectly. She stood up, her decision crystallizing with a sharp, painful clarity that surpassed any legal advice she had ever given. She wasn't going to spend another day being the woman who won the battle but lost the war. She picked up her coat, left the files on her desk, and walked out of the office for the last time. Not as a crisis manager, but as a woman desperate to fix the only catastrophe she had ever created. She walked toward the elevator, the cold marble of the office feeling like the skin of a snake she had finally painfully shed. The drive through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan felt like a journey across a foreign landscape for Sophia Reed, her usually hyper-focused mind entirely consumed by a singular, frantic objective. She had abandoned her pristine office, leaving behind the lucrative contracts and the buzzing phones that had once defined her entire existence, trading her impenetrable corporate armor for the terrifying vulnerability of the truth. The city lights blurred against the tinted windows of the town car, mirroring the chaotic swirl of emotions tearing through her chest as she approached the towering glass edifice of Alexander's private residence. For years, she had operated as a phantom in the high-stakes world of billionaires and boardrooms, expertly fixing other people's lives while meticulously isolating her own heart from any collateral damage. But as she stepped out into the freezing winter air, the biting wind whipping her dark hair around her face, she realized that Alexander Vance was the one variable she could no longer control. She bypassed the grand lobby's security with a sharp, familiar nod to the doorman, stepping into the private elevator that would take her to the penthouse. The silent, high-speed ascent felt agonizingly slow, every passing floor a heavy reminder of the profound betrayal she had inflicted on the only man who had dared to look past her ruthless reputation and see the woman beneath. When the elevator doors finally slid open with a soft, melodic chime, the sprawling, minimalist penthouse was shrouded in heavy, suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the ambient, glittering glow of the city skyline pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sophia stepped onto the polished concrete floor, her heels clicking softly in the vast empty space, her eyes scanning the shadows for the man who had effectively dismantled her perfectly ordered universe. She found him standing outside on the sprawling terrace, a solitary, brooding silhouette braced against the freezing wind, his broad shoulders tense as he stared down at the restless city below. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand, the ice clinking softly as he took a slow, deliberate sip, looking entirely like a deposed king mourning the ashes of his kingdom. Sophia took a deep, steadying breath, fighting the instinct to retreat behind her professional detachment, and stepped out onto the terrace, the harsh cold immediately biting through her thin silk blouse. "I left the firm," she stated, her voice stripping away the polished, commanding cadence she usually wielded, leaving only a raw, quiet honesty that seemed to startle the very air around them. Alexander went utterly rigid, the tumbler freezing halfway to his mouth as the sound of her voice shattered his isolated reverie, his knuckles turning white around the crystal glass. He slowly turned to face her, his jade eyes narrowing with a mixture of deep, lingering pain and profound, wary confusion as the harsh wind whipped between them. "Is this a new strategy, Sophia?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that lacked all of its usual arrogant warmth, slicing through her defenses with lethal precision. "Did you calculate that a dramatic resignation would be the perfect final act to solidify my public sympathy, or are you just here to collect your final performance review?" Sophia flinched, the words landing like physical blows, a brutal reflection of the monster she had allowed herself to become in the name of winning the war. She didn't retreat. Instead, she took a deliberate step closer, closing the physical distance even as the emotional chasm between them felt impossibly wide. "There is no strategy, Alexander, and there is no script," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, a microscopic crack in her composure that made his eyes widen in sudden, genuine surprise. "I resigned because the moment they put those handcuffs on your uncle, I realized I had won a victory that tasted like ash, because it cost me the only thing I actually wanted." The fierce wind howled around the penthouse terrace, whipping Sophia's hair across her pale face, but she made no move to brush it away. Her dark eyes locked onto Alexander's with a desperate, unyielding intensity. "I spent my entire life building walls, Alexander, engineering reality for other people, because I was absolutely terrified of living in my own," she confessed, the words pouring out of her in a hurried, breathless torrent as she laid her soul completely bare. "When you kissed me at the gala, when you looked at me like I was the center of your universe, it terrified me so much that I fell back on the only survival tactic I knew. I treated you like a variable to be managed instead of a man to be loved." Alexander stared at her, the harsh lines of his jaw working furiously as he processed the monumental weight of her admission, the anger in his eyes warring violently with the undeniable, desperate longing that still tethered him to her. "You let me believe I was just a pawn on your chessboard, Sophia," he growled, taking a step toward her, his towering presence dominating the space, demanding the absolute truth. "You let me stand in that interrogation room, feeling like an absolute fool for trusting you. So tell me, how am I supposed to believe that this isn't just another beautiful, calculated lie?" Sophia reached into her pocket with a trembling hand, retrieving the dazzling diamond engagement ring they had used to deceive the world, the platinum band catching the faint ambient light of the city. She didn't hand it to him. Instead, she gently placed it on the cold stone railing of the terrace, a symbolic surrender of the contract, the control and the deception that had defined their relationship. "You don't have to believe the crisis manager, Alexander," she whispered, stepping directly into his personal space, her hands tentatively reaching up to rest against the lapels of his dark coat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "But I am asking you to believe the woman who is standing in the freezing rain without a single defense left, telling you that she is deeply, irrevocably in love with you." It was the first time in her life she had ever surrendered power, the first time she had ever handed someone the absolute ability to destroy her, and the sheer, breathtaking terror of it was completely liberating. Alexander looked down at her, his breath catching, as he saw the genuine tears pooling in her dark eyes, witnessing the formidable, untouchable Sophia Reed completely dismantle herself for him. The crystal tumbler slipped from his grip, shattering violently against the concrete floor in an explosion of glass and amber liquid, a sharp, definitive end to his hesitation. With a ragged, desperate groan that was torn from the very depths of his chest, Alexander's arms came around her like a vice, crushing her flesh against his body with a possessive, overwhelming force. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the sharp, intoxicating scent of citrus and espresso that haunted his dreams, his large hands gripping her waist as if he were terrified she might evaporate into the winter mist. "You are the most infuriating, ruthless, brilliant woman I have ever met," he breathed against her skin, his voice thick with a raw, unadulterated relief that sent a violent shudder through her entire frame. "And I swear to God, if you ever try to manage my life again, I will fire you myself." Sophia let out a wet, genuine laugh, a sound of pure, unbridled joy that echoed brightly across the desolate terrace, her arms wrapping tightly around his neck as she pulled him even closer. He lifted his head, his green eyes burning with a fierce, possessive fire, and crushed his mouth against hers, kissing her with a hungry, desperate devotion that obliterated the last remnants of their painful past. It was a kiss devoid of cameras, free from corporate espionage and board members, a raw, messy, and perfect collision of two souls who had finally found their sanctuary in the chaos of each other. 6 months later, the opulent ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria hummed with the refined, glittering energy of the annual Vance Enterprises Charity Gala, a stark contrast to the battlefield it had been the year prior. The corporate war was a distant memory. Marcus Vance was awaiting trial in a federal facility, and Alexander had solidified his position not just as the CEO, but as a respected visionary leader who had navigated his company through its darkest storm. Sophia stood by the grand bar, nursing a glass of champagne, her emerald silk gown replaced by a stunning, understated black velvet dress. Her demeanor no longer a rigid fortress, but a relaxed, radiant confidence. She had launched her own independent strategic firm, choosing her clients with ruthless precision, operating not as Alexander's shadow, but as his equal, formidable partner in both business and life. Alexander moved through the crowd of high society elites with an easy, magnetic charm, but his eyes constantly instinctively tracked back to Sophia, anchoring himself to the woman who commanded his heart. As he approached her, politely dismissing a persistent investor, he slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her flesh against his side with a natural, unscripted affection that made the surrounding cameras completely irrelevant. "You look bored, Mr. Vance," Sophia murmured, tilting her head back to look at him, a playful, challenging smirk dancing on her lips as she traced the line of his jaw with a single manicured finger. "I am simply calculating how quickly I can reasonably steal you away from this insufferable crowd without triggering a PR nightmare for my favorite strategic consultant," Alexander replied, his voice a low, seductive hum that sent a familiar, thrilling shiver down her spine. He took her hand, weaving their fingers together, and smoothly guided her away from the flashing lights and prying eyes, slipping through a set of heavy mahogany doors onto a secluded, moonlit balcony overlooking the restless city. The distant hum of the gala faded into a gentle murmur, leaving them isolated in a private bubble of quiet intimacy. The night air warm and heavy with the promise of the future they were building. Alexander turned to face her, the playful arrogance melting away, replaced by an expression of such profound, naked adoration that it made Sophia's breath catch in her throat. "The first time we did this, you handed me a 50-page contract and a highly publicized ultimatum," he said, reaching into the inner pocket of his tuxedo to retrieve a small, dark velvet box, his green eyes shining with an absolute unwavering certainty. Alexander slowly dropped to one knee on the marble balcony, the billionaire CEO surrendering his absolute power to the only woman who had ever truly mastered him. Flipping the velvet box open to reveal a stunning, flawless, emerald-cut diamond. "This time, Sophia, there are no media narratives, no escape clauses, and absolutely no exit strategies," he stated, his voice ringing with a deep, resonant conviction that filled the quiet night air. "I am giving you total, permanent control of my heart, and I am asking you to be my partner, my equal, and my wife for the rest of our lives." Sophia stared down at the man who had torn down her walls, her heart overflowing with a fierce, boundless love that defied every logical parameter she had ever known. Genuine tears of joy threatening to spill over her lashes. She didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate the variables. She simply followed the raw, undeniable truth of her own soul. "Yes, Alexander," she whispered, her voice choking on a sob of pure happiness as she pulled him up from the floor, throwing her arms around his neck. 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect, permanent fit, and pulled her into a deep, loving kiss, sealing a reality that was infinitely more beautiful than any fiction she could have ever engineered.